to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
All right, folks, welcome back to Mind Escape. I am your host, Mike. This is episode number 325. We are joined by special guest Sam. Is it Woolfe or Woolfe?
It's Woolfe.
Woolfe. Yeah. Sam Woolfe. And we've had Sam on before to discuss some of his past writings. He's a journalist, and now he's most recently written a book called Altered Perspectives. And we're going to dive into that. And we're going to kind of pick up where we left off because there's a lot of stuff we discussed in the first episode we did with him. I don't know, it must have been a couple years ago at this point. There's a lot of themes that we've discussed that are in this book, and it's kind of like the perfect intersection if you're into philosophy and psychedelics and all the weird stuff involved with consciousness. So I highly recommend that. And you can check out his book. You can go to his website. I have the link down below. And we've got his website. Check it out. You can buy his book. And I also have the Amazon link for his book down there as well. And if you want to support Mind Escape, all you have to do is click the LinkTree link down below. Also, people keep asking. I recently moved a bunch of our older episodes onto our Patreon. For just $2 a month, you can get access to that and other exclusive content that was already on Patreon before that's never been public. So check that out. And I just released episode 5 of Masters of Rhetoric, called Plato and the Sophists. I highly recommend that if you are interested in Plato and Plato's dialogues and dialectic. Please go check that out. And without further ado, welcome back on. Sam, how are you?
Yeah, doing good. Yeah, thanks for having me back on. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I read your book, Altered Perspectives. And again, it just kind of rang true with things that we've been discussing on this podcast for years, conversations you and I have had, things that are in articles that you've written. And I should say the full title of the book is Altered Perspectives, Critical Essays on Psychedelic Consciousness. So I think we discussed this last time, but the first time I came across your work, I think it was a piece that kind of went viral of yours where you were discussing DMT jesters and tricksters and things like that, and part of our subconscious and our psyche and things of that nature. So yeah, that's kind of how I became aware of your work. And then from there, we just started riffing, and we've had you on the show. And I know you don't do a ton of podcasts, so I really appreciate you doing this. Now, going through your book, I want to start. I wrote a few things down. I've been trying to do that when I read people's books lately. I try and take some pieces that I find interesting to ask questions about if I have them on. But can you elaborate on the connection between Hume's philosophy and the combination between that and the mescaline experiences and any sort of crossover there with Buddhist teachings that kind of play into that?
Sure. So this relates to the first essay in my book, which is on the connections between particular mescaline experiences I had and how they relate to Hume's ideas on personal identity and also Buddhist views on the self. I'd come across Hume's ideas on personal identity at university. He writes about these in his work, A Treatise on Human Nature. And for Hume, when he applied introspection and he examined the self, he essentially found, as the Buddhists did, that it doesn't really amount to anything concrete. Like this is a view that's become more popular, especially with Sam Harris. He's promoted this position. In Buddhism, it's called anatta, or no self. And yeah, it's essentially the idea that the self is illusory, in the sense that there is no core essence to who we are as people. And for Hume, much like the Buddhists, he thinks of the self more as a constellation of different properties. So there's like physical appearance, there's like personality traits, there's sensations, feelings, perceptions. Hume calls these a bundle of perceptions. So for Hume, he subscribes to this view of the self called bundle theory, which is more broadly a theory of perception. In essence, it's the idea that there is no essence to anything, to any object. Every object or everything that exists has a bundle of properties, but it has no kind of core essence that if you strip everything away, you're just left with it. So much like everything else that exists, Hume thought of the self as something else that has no essence. Hume discovered this through introspection. The Buddhists likewise discover it through introspection, through vipassana meditation. This being a method for discovering the nature of reality, one aspect of which is no self, as in there is no self in any object, including humans. And yeah, this crossover kind of came into focus for me after some experiences with mescaline, where I just found myself introspecting, and I also didn't discover any essence behind, I guess, my sense of who I am. I kind of just saw myself visually, I guess, through a series of visions as more like fleeting changes in mood or personality over the course of the day or over the course of weeks. But I really couldn't locate any core behind these impressions, behind these changing impressions. And then after this experience, it just reminded me of Hume's theory, which I'd studied a long time ago. And it reminded me of my current readings on Buddhism. So yeah, this later turned into this essay for this book, which is drawing these similarities between the three, between psychedelics, Hume, and Buddhism.
Did you feel it necessary to partake in these compounds to write about them? Are there ones that you wrote about that you have not tried, or like how did that work, or how did that play into it? Did you only write what you knew, or was there some level of you felt like you had an idea of what was going on, so you inserted an opinion?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about the experiences that I've had that I feel are relevant to the topics. These are mostly with mescaline and DMT. I've used other compounds, and they've kind of informed the kind of general thoughts I have, even if I don't explicitly talk about the experiences. Otherwise, I refer to, I guess, patterns of experience which may emerge in clinical research or from anecdotal reports that might be found on Erowid or Reddit. And yeah, otherwise through speaking to people, and kind of getting a gist from the psychedelic community of the common experiences people have.
Yeah, and people are like, oh, for me, I still have never tried DMT. Like I said, I'll never go out of my way. It was just something that wasn't popular when I was doing a lot of my experimenting when I was younger. And I've been offered it a long time ago, as I mentioned on the last podcast with Matthew Palmieri at a fish show, and it just didn't seem like the the right person. It just didn't feel, the whole thing didn't feel right, so I didn't jump on it then, and I don't necessarily regret it now. I said it in the future, if it ever comes across my path, cool. If not, no big deal. But I feel like having done so many other things, the only thing that I felt like that was different was maybe salvia. Felt like so out of the realm of the normal 5-HT2A serotonergic receptor psychedelic, or your typical tryptamine, or even a phenethylamine or whatever. It felt very different. But that was kind of the only thing I've ever done where I didn't have a sense, in the experience of like, oh, there's some portion of this that's feels recognizable, if that makes sense.
Mm. As in, it just felt completely alien or unlike any
Yeah,
other.
so like salvia felt completely alien, and I should say that this was a long time ago. I was in high school and a little bit in college, and that was when it was legal to buy at like pipe shops and head shops and things like that. Now I think that there's only one or two states. I think maybe South Carolina it's still legal to buy. But yeah, so it just felt so alien. And even that, you watch Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia and he's chewing on the quids
Mm.
of the leaves, and it seems like a far more pleasant experience that way than even smoking. So maybe if I had to make an analogy, even though I've never done DMT, I would say maybe ayahuasca is like similar to chewing the quids as opposed to smoking. So like smoking salvia would be similar to smoking DMT, akin to the ayahuasca and the quids kind of a thing.
Mm.
But in terms of like from even mushrooms and LSD and all those, there was definitely differences. But like I said, there was some like element of like connectiveness of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like the route of administration, you ingest it, and these are like 5-HT2A agonists. So, I mean, mescaline kind of affects dopamine a bit more, but they're all primarily achieving effects through 5-HT2A. So it makes sense there's going to be a lot of similarities. There was actually, I think, a study last year or maybe the year before comparing mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin. And I mean, there might be issues with the study, like the kind of questionnaires they used, but they found no difference in reports of subjective effects. Um, so I think if you don't know what drug you're taking, it's very possible to find the similar effects between the classic ones.
That's the ultimate Coke challenge right there, right? Which one? Guess which one it is, right? In your essay on noetic experiences, you reference Spinoza's concept of God. I think we've discussed this before when we've had Peter Scherstedt on. But how do psychedelic experiences influence one's kind of understanding of divinity according to Spinoza's philosophy?
Mm. Yeah, so I think much like other ideas in philosophy, the way in which psychedelics have a relation is through direct experience. So it's up for debate what the experience itself refers to in objective reality, but at least subjectively, I think one often has, especially in more mystical or high dose states, a kind of pantheistic or panpsychist experience. And so Spinoza was both a pantheist and panpsychist. So in the mystical state induced by psychedelics, there's often a sense of the self dissolving into something much bigger. And this something bigger is often framed as God or the divine or divinity. Um, and also, there tends to be kind of panpsychist themes. So one has the sense that this thing that one dissolves into is conscious, that it is a conscious mind. And much like Spinoza's God, this mind contains everything. It contains all attributes. It contains all features, all information. I mean, not everyone is going to interpret this through a Spinozaistic lens, but often when people read Spinoza and his ethics and they read his description of God, they often find there's a similarity, especially because Spinoza frames God as he kind of equates God with eternity. or his essence is eternity. And yeah, this often manifests in psychedelics as well, I think.
Yeah, and there's this idea too that like nature is God, right? So like if you
Mm.
take these compounds and become one, and you become one with nature, well, then you're becoming one with, you could technically make an argument of God and his sense of it. And I know Einstein was, not like a religious person, but I think he was fond of Spinoza's philosophies regarding these topics.
Yeah, true. Yeah, he very much was like in agreement with Spinoza. And so, yeah, in a sense, psychedelics can kind of open you up to this felt feeling of pantheism, this feeling of becoming either encountering the universe and treating it as God, or becoming one with the universe and identifying that oneness as divine.
Absolutely. Um, in your book, you discuss like alien beings and compare it to birth trauma. What evidence do you think supports that hypothesis? Um, and how might it explain these psychedelic experiences? And that's not the first time, by the way. We've had other people on to discuss DMT experiences where it feels like they're either being operated on or being given birth to, things of that nature. So,
Mm. Yeah, so I came across a ufologist called Alvin H. Lawson, who he presented this theory of UFO abductions as a reactivation of birth memories. And he made different connections between UFO abduction phenomena and the processes that happen during birth. And yeah, this was also a theory that Stan Groff used, building on the ideas of Otto Rank and his book, Birth Trauma, The Trauma of Birth. And for him, he very much found LSD experiences were a form of reactivating what he considered the trauma of birth. And he developed these perinatal matrices, which are kind of four maps of experience that correlate to four different stages of birth. And if there's difficulties during birth, he thought these would lead on to issues in adulthood, and in visionary experiences, these particular difficulties during birth would manifest in certain ways during the visions. Like if one had a difficult journey through the birth canal, he thought this would manifest in a particular way during LSD experiences. In terms of the evidence for the theory, there's definitely correlations one could make between the symbolism of birth-related or perinatal experiences that one might have during abduction experiences or on psychedelics. But yeah, the science isn't really too conclusive. If anything, the science kind of discounts the theory because we don't have good evidence that anyone can form durable memories before the age of 2. And that's the earliest. Most people don't form durable memories until 3 or 4. So
yeah, I mean, I have an amazing memory, and I think that, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, it's just one of the amazing traits I do have. And 3 is, I think, where I begin my memory journey. Like you said, I think anything before that, I rarely find people that are credible that claim to remember anything before, like 3, 4, 5, those ages. So I think what you're saying definitely rings true. And if anybody's interested, we made a documentary called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT, where we actually focus on that exact topic, the crossover between the whole UFO abduction phenomena and the DMT / psychedelic experience. And I don't think a lot of people got our documentary, or what I was going for at least, which is this idea that our minds are just super powerful tools, and But we're still flawed, right? We still have flawed memories. We still have cognitive biases. We still have, we still have things that are detracting from being able to make up this full picture of reality, if you will. And I find myself, after making the documentary, spending a lot of time interacting with a lot of the UFO community and people that are interested in the topic. And my takeaways, I'm even more confused than when I started, especially in relationship to the mind. And I find myself identifying more with Jung's take on it. And I'm not just saying that because it sounds cool or, psychologically elitist, but it just, there's like an ambiguous vibe to it that I don't think we can grasp in our current evolution. So whether it's fully mental or there is something out there that we're maybe assigning a symbol to as a placeholder for something that we can't fathom or understand, that we'll be able to quantify or measure sometime in the future. That's, for me, that's yet to be determined. But I want to segue into this next question, which was in our last conversation. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, my introduction to your work came in the form of your article on DMT entities. So could you share more about your insights on the jester, the trickster, these figures that are encountered within the DMT realm? And then also, how do you feel about that topic now, having been a few years out from writing the article that you wrote on it?
Yeah, it's definitely a big topic in the psychedelic space, and there's a lot of strong opinions. I guess you could say there's a divide between whether these entities are externally existing or internally generated. I don't know how my thoughts have changed. I mean, in the essay you mentioned, I definitely take a kind of Jungian approach to jester entities, because things like jesters or other entities that are commonly encountered, like clowns, imps, elves, one could say that they fall under this kind of trickster archetype, which is one of the most common archetypes one finds in stories and cultures, and also in what some might call hallucinations. So a common type of hallucination with or without drugs are these Lilliputian hallucinations, or hallucinations of little people. And they're not dressed as jesters, or they don't always look like elves, but they often act in tricksterish ways, like climbing on top of people, kind of pulling at their clothes. That's often how they're presented and experienced. Um, and I think, tricksters, to me, they seem very anthropomorphic, and they seem very much um, an aspect of human psychology, human comedy. Um, the kind of role that tricksters have played in many cultures has been very important. Um, they often help people through difficult times. They're often essential to keeping those in authority in check. So I think I do kind of lean towards these tricksters and trickster entities as human expressions, um, as very meaningful expressions of who we are. And I think they can often come up as aspects of selves that have not been expressed, or that perhaps they come up because they should be integrated into who we are or how we conduct ourselves in everyday life. But the question of whether they exist externally, I mean, it remains to be seen. It's possible for entities to be related to evolved cognitive tendencies as well as exist externally to us. I mean, this is often an argument given against what you might call the neurobiology of religious experience, like just because encountering the divine has neural correlates, that doesn't disprove the existence of the divine. There's a counter argument that perhaps God designed us with these neural correlates in order that we might perceive him. So there's always the possibility that we have neural correlates of what might be called the trickster, or we have evolved mechanisms that allow us to perceive tricksters because these tricksters exist, and so these mechanisms allow us to perceive them. Yeah, I'm not too sure where I stand on that. I mean, the principle of Occam's razor kind of makes me want to find the simplest explanation, and so that often involves shaving off kind of unnecessary assumptions. And I think it's possible to explain entity encounters through human psychology without having to assume also the existence of external entities. I think that fits the data equally as well. So I think for the sake of parsimony, I wouldn't assume the existence of entities.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I could see it going both ways. I could see there being some sort of external energy or force that we're not aware of, but I could also see that once you reach a certain level of these compounds, I don't mean what level of highness or whatever, maybe it strips the pareidolia or the normal brain function, and you could say default mode network or whatever, but you could get to this point where you're stripping everything away till all you're left with is your subconscious or your inner monologue or voice or something like that. I guess my question would be at that point then, why does it default to this thing or this being, and why is it messing with, you know what I'm saying? Like, I guess that would be what I would wonder about at that point. But I could see definitely what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, I have noticed kind of a definite uptick in reports of DMT jesters. And I mean, the kind of entities that people encounter, I think they do differ between cultures and between people. So it's kind of the fact that they're so culturally influenced and based on expectation and what you read. For me, it kind of just plays into the whole idea of set and setting, as opposed to you being given direct access to these entities, because these entities shift, these entities vary between trips, between people, between cultures. So for me, that kind of shows the kind of non-specific amplification effect as opposed to the direct access to common reality effect that people think psychedelics give. I mean, there's definitely.
I mean, it's similar though to consciousness in general then, right? Because we're not aware of the origin of consciousness, yet we can all experience it, right? That's what we're experiencing right now. So, I mean, the fact that we can't explain it doesn't mean that, like you're saying, that there's not some sort of scientific or rational explanation, but at the same time, it's like we're kind of in the same place, because if we don't understand consciousness, we then can't understand the extensions of it, as things that we're mentioning here. Not that they don't need to be investigated, but I feel like that's kind of, you could go either way. You could take it the furthest way possible and become kind of like not necessarily a nihilist, but I don't even know what you would consider that. Just somebody that believes that these are all just physical, they're just byproducts of physical properties or something like that. So you become kind of like a materialist or a physicalist or something along those lines. But yeah, I don't know. It's definitely interesting. That's for sure.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. That kind of consciousness is the fundamental question or the fundamental mystery, and different metaphysics of consciousness could have different implications for what these entity encounters mean, or even other experiences that are considered paranormal. I mean, I know Bernardo Kastrup, who subscribes to idealism, is more open-minded about kind of paranormal experiences or the afterlife. because those experiences might make more sense under idealism than they would materialism. So I think views on consciousness will definitely impact what you think about, these kinds of non-ordinary states.
Yeah, I just think that, to your point though about like everybody experiencing different things, but they're experiencing something. I think that's the same thing as like language. Like I think language informs our consciousness to a certain level. So culturally, you're gonna experience whatever this thing is using the mask of whatever your culture allows it to be, if you will, or something along those lines. So, yeah, I don't know. Again, it's one of those things where you could just give the easy thing and say science will eventually figure it out. I think that's always the easy way out, right? It's almost like a Richard Dawkins perspective. Everything's already kind of figured out, and or science will eventually figure it out. But I think that you have to put in the hard work, and I think that there's a lot of people that would beg the differ that have had life altering experiences or weird things happen. And yeah, I'm just open-minded about the whole thing because I've had the weird experiences. I've had weird things happen, but I also see these communities and know that there's a lot of BS in them and a lot on these topics too. And it's not necessarily, I don't think it's anything malicious. I just think that people have a tough time being honest with themselves, doing the actual work, doing the homework, that kind of a thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always more comfort in certainty than uncertainty. Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a balance between not wanting to be kind of not subscribing to scientism, like thinking that science is going to solve everything on the one hand, but then also you don't want to fall into the trap of like these arguments from ignorance where just because science hasn't discovered something or given a perspective on something, you don't then want to latch on to some other explanation. So, yeah, you want to be open-minded about what science might discover, while at the same time not thinking that science can or will solve every problem. I mean, there's some problems
Well,
that
and
aren't scientific.
to that point too, science is a process, right? Like I think a lot of people will assign science to a specific scientist, and so just because that scientist is well regarded or renowned or whatever, that then that person represents that whole topic or something like that. So I've seen that a lot in communities too, where people will buck against that kind of a thing, but it's in regards, it's only like one person out of how many people doing the same kind of research, you know what I'm saying? So I think it's more about patience and just understanding these things take time, and you have to kind of come to the personal conclusion, and this is just my opinion, but if you have a personal philosophy, you have to include the fact that there's always constant change and allow for the future to be able to change your mind, because if you're not, what are you doing? Things evolve. We know far more now than we did 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever it is, So if you're not accounting for this ability to change or alter your opinions given new information, then I think you're doing yourself a huge disservice. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
In your book, you're in the essays, there's a lot of plant spirits and psychedelic teleology, which anybody doesn't know what teleology is, it's the study of purpose. What role do you think plant spirits have on the experience? And do you think so? Let's say plants do have some level of consciousness. Do you think that informs the trip at all? Or what do you think's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, I have become more open to the concept of plant consciousness, partly because of this growing field of plant neurobiology. So I don't think it's becoming less controversial, the idea that plants may have a form of consciousness consistent with like botany or consistent with plant science. but also because of panpsychism. Panpsychism offers a kind of legitimate and possibly viable solution to the mind-body problem. And if panpsychism is true, as in there is ubiquitous consciousness in the universe and different degrees of consciousness, then under that worldview, plants would have some form of consciousness. It's unlikely it would be of the sort higher animals like animals have, or that um, mammals like us have. Um, but I think under both views, like plant neurobiology and panpsychism, it's still hard to imagine the kind of ingestion of psychedelic plants leading to encounters with that form of consciousness. I mean, one of the reasons I look at in the book is known as the interaction problem for dualism. This goes back to Descartes, who proposed a substance dualism between mind and body. And one of the critiques that was given to him by his contemporaries and still given today is he didn't seem able to explain how these two fundamentally different substances interact. Like, how does body interact with soul? I mean, Descartes later explained it through this idea of animal spirits being mediated by the pineal gland, but I think most scientists today probably wouldn't give that much
Yes.
serious thought.
I mean, like a precursor to panpsychism would have been like Aristotelian idea of consciousness, which is there's three forms of consciousness. There's plant consciousness, there's animal consciousness, which animal consciousness incorporates plant consciousness, but then its own little bit. And then you have human consciousness. So then human consciousness also incorporates the plant and the animal. So if you look at like a big diagram, like the humans overlapping all of it, the plant has the most basic form of it, then animals incorporate, and then, you know, kind of like that. I could kind of see that being like the precursor to panpsychism in a way, because you're already parsing the spectrum of consciousness for each awareness.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely fits in, yeah, with the whole idea of gradations of consciousness. But yeah, I mean, going back to the problem of the interaction problem, I mean, so it could be that there is forms of plant consciousness, maybe not spirits, because I mean that adds a kind of supernatural perspective, which may be true. But if we focus just on plant consciousness, because of the problem of interaction, it has to be explained how ingesting the physical plant, then through the biochemistry of the psychedelic in the brain, allows the encounter with the plant consciousness. Because I would assume under plant neurobiology and panpsychism, plant consciousness, like other forms of consciousness, depends on the physical complexity of the organism. So if you digest the organism and then you just end up with the chemical, the psychedelic, I find it hard to see how that retains the plant consciousness, because you've reduced it just to this very simple molecule.
Yeah, so I think this is something I brought up a long time ago. I think it was when we had Peter Scherstedt on a while back, but this idea that, so, you know, they call like ayahuasca the vine of souls or whatever. Like, could, let's say, bodies decompose or animals decompose or whatever, and their most fundamental elements go back into the earth. If there's any kind of truth to panpsychism, couldn't those particles then be reconfigured in a way, whether it's part of this plant or whatever, psychedelic, that would then be kind of like, basically you would be experiencing other consciousnesses through these substances, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's a difficult question. I mean, it depends. I don't know. 'Cause I still think of the kind of forms of consciousness as dependent on the structure the material structure in which they're correlated. I mean, perhaps there's a way to explain how the forms of consciousness remain intact through decomposition, but
Well, just maybe that particles or subatomic particles or whatever configured in a certain way. If anything's living, then there might be like a history or something programmed into those. Maybe not, but maybe there's some, trace of that or whatever, if that makes sense.
yeah, I see where you're coming from. Um, I suppose under a more like a non-materialistic perspective, maybe that could be possible. In that sense, the consciousness may be tied to the forms of material, but it maybe not dependent on them. So yeah, it could be that
I mean,
the
and I
essence.
get your point too. Like these things have to be organized in a very specific way for consciousness to arise in the first place. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying, like for instance, we've talked a lot about near-death experiences. I've had my own near-death experience. We had this guy Rob Gentile on who was given a new heart from this girl who passed away, and then he had all sorts of cravings that this girl had he didn't know, and then he talked with the family and he's like, I've got a hankering for this, and they're like, oh, that was her favorite candy or whatever, or, things like that. So maybe organs have some level of conscious, do you get what I'm saying? So it's like, I get what you're saying, and I'm saying from like a super complex understanding of the universe. I'm saying on a very basic level, there might be some information being encoded there, and that information might come out during those experiences. But I do understand what you're saying and the problem that you're having, entertaining that idea fully, because I kind of feel the same way to a certain degree.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely heard similar things about like recipients of organ transplants describing these things. Maybe even something with someone receiving like the heart of a pig, they start feeling more animalistic kinds of feelings.
I want to go roll around in the mud.
Yeah. I don't know. I would have to think about it. I mean, it could be that there's a way to explain. Maybe we'll discover that there's ways for organs to retain information or something like memory-like information. I mean, there is like discussion about generational trauma and kind of genetic memories.
Yeah, epigenetics for sure.
Yeah. So who knows? I mean, the science is changing. 50 years ago, to talk about plant consciousness would have been pretty sacrilege. And it still is. Like most mainstream botanists are not open to it, and they did band together and kind of submit a paper for a journal kind of arguing against plant consciousness. I mean, I'm not necessarily a proponent of it because there's maybe, you know, evolutionary things that have to be worked out. If plants don't move, why would they evolve the ability to be conscious? But then obviously you can argue in a panpsychist way against that by suggesting consciousness was already there, and evolution doesn't even need consciousness to begin with.
And they don't need to interact and procreate like we do. Obviously seeds and things get picked up by birds, fly in the wind. There's a level of surviving and the genetics surviving without actually, like you said, having to do much work. And they're kind of amazing in their own way. So whether they have the same kind of consciousness or awareness as we do, or some different kind of awareness, I think that's another thing. Is like that's a cognitive bias, in my opinion, is assigning what we know as consciousness or awareness to other things, and then anthropomorphizing it, or like, how can we compare this to us? But it might just be something that's not comparable. And I would say it's comparable in the sense that it's a carbon-based life form, but you get what I'm saying. I mean photosynthesis is very different than how we operate. But let's see here. Oh, I wanted to ask you, what's your take on this well, we're talking about like DMT and DMT entities. This guy that's using lasers to try, I think what's his name? Is it Danny Goler or David Goler or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah,
And he's, just so everyone knows, he's projecting lasers while in the DMT state, and he is saying that there's a code or some sort of language encoded in these lasers that he thinks could be like the source code of reality or something along those lines.
yeah. I came across it, and then I read a really good piece by Ed Prideaux for Ecstatic Integration on the whole DMT laser experiment, and I thought he offered some kind of good, um, yeah, more kind of skeptical point of views. I mean, the fact that when these experiments are carried out, people are kind of already primed and told and expected that they're going to have an experience of seeing code. So going back to the aspects of set and setting, I think that's likely to influence people's experiences. And then there's also the weird fact that it is strange. People are seeing common types of symbols. They're described as kind of katakana type symbols, like Japanese characters that are seen in the Matrix, the kind of green neon code that streams down in the Matrix. But again, I think because of set and setting, if there is an expectation to see these types of characters, it's kind of unsurprising they would show up quite frequently. Um, and it's also weird if, as Danny Gola claims, these are kind of showing the like kind of stripping away the veil behind the simulation and showing the code that makes it. It would be strange that the simulators are using human like languages. They're using katakana symbols. Um, for me, that suggests more human influence, human psychology than the likelihood of alien or alien influence. I imagine if aliens were using code to simulate realities, it wouldn't look like a human language at all. It would look very different. Maybe something like you might see in Arrival, the film, where they use kind of more like ink blots, or it would be something completely different that wouldn't look anything like a human language, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in the sense of language, because you bring up Arrival, which I think is a great example where what those beings, they grew, the 7 appendages, so that's how they interpreted their language on their planet and everything, and that's how they came. So it was very different than human models. And in that movie, was it Amy Adams kind of breaks that code, if you will, or whatever. Spoiler alert. But in terms of, I saw Andrew Gallimore, I think, going back and forth with him. And it's definitely interesting. I think it's like one of those weird things. I mean, who knows? And the other thing I was thinking of is there's something about, like, I don't know enough about lasers. I know it's obviously it was a huge breakthrough for humanity when we figured it out, but in laser optics and things like that. And I don't know. I've never done DMT, so I can't really speak to that. I'm sure there's people sitting at home right now. They're like, dude, I've done it. It works. Like maybe there's something to it. I don't know. But I just know that whenever I see something like that, I'm not like immediately skeptical per se, but it's just like, if this person figured this out, then it should be apparent to everybody. And I've seen, like you said, there's people that are skeptical or detractors, or people that have tried it and didn't experience the same thing, and things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, even separate from the experiment, I mean, it's worth mentioning that visions of strange writing is very common on DMT, which,
I've
yeah,
speculated, for possible ancient psychedelic use, some of these iconography, or even like if you go to Mesoamerica, like look at the Aztecs, was there was there aesthetic influence that maybe by their psilocybin use, things like that. I've definitely
Mm.
thought about things like that, symbols and, whether you're talking about like ancient hieroglyphs or cuneiform or whatever. I mean, could that be possible? Yeah, I think that that could be possible, but again, what's possible and what's probable are two very different things.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. That was when I visited Mexico and looked at all the kind of the pyramids and the engravings. That was my impression. It all seemed very psilocybin-like. I was just walking around being like these kind of tendril-like patterns and spirals and branching patterns. It was very, to me, it seemed very psilocybin-like. And we know they have, the Aztecs and the Maya had documented psilocybin use, so it's very
Yeah, the
possible.
Vienna
Because
Codex.
Mhm.
Yeah, actually, if anybody's interested, it was a while ago, and I don't really subscribe to a lot of this guy's other stuff, but Tom Lane, who wrote the book Sacred Mushroom Rituals: A Search for Quetzalcoatl, we did like a 4-part series with him where he kind of breaks down the symbolism in the Vienna Codex and the he did a ritual with Maria Sabina in the 70s, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff there for sure. And I think that based on the conversation with him, there was a lot of stuff that just made sense. If you don't have to be like some sort of archaeologist or even an anthropologist to make some of these connections, kind of like what you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's always the kind of trope of the psychonaut or hippie who connects everything to psychedelics, but definitely you start to see certain things which, yeah, quote unquote, become more psychedelic, like the domes of mosques, and yeah, it kind of invites questions about the influence behind these designs, and
That
yeah.
okay, so the mosque thing's interesting because I remember, I don't know how many years ago, but I was on a high dose psilocybin and I started seeing pictures on Instagram of those beautiful mosaics and all that stuff, and it kind of just it started to do some stuff. And I know that like patterns normally flow. Obviously, I've done it plenty of times to know, the carpet moves a little or the walls start to, all that kind of stuff. Things flow together. But something about that, when you look at those, you trip harder. And I don't know what it is. I can't really explain it. But it's almost like when you look at that, it does something to you when you're in that experience. So I do think that there is a connection there. I'm not saying that it was the source of that, but there's something there.
Yeah, this possible connection I did write about in a piece. Yeah, I think it was a while ago, a few years ago, about the psychedelic nature of Islamic art and architecture, and whether there might be, yeah, a possible psychedelic influence. I mean, we know there's kind of a tradition of use of hashish and Syrian rue in the Islamic world. Um, but yeah, whether they were making kind of ayahuasca admixtures or using other compounds, it's hard to say. But it's potential. There's potential for high dose hash use to lead to kind of geometric visions, possibly.
And we've discussed
So,
that. Obviously, there's speculations on what Soma was.
mm,
The Avesta, which is you have the Rig Veda, which was the northwestern people that migrated to India, and then you have the Avesta, which is the people that migrated down into Iraq and Iran, and then those people had a culture of Homa, which was kind of like this break off of Soma, and there's speculations on what that could be. Could it be cannabis? Could it be a mixture of
mm,
different things? But regardless, I think anything psychoactive mixed with ritual was definitely in play at the time. I mean, there's people that
mm,
argue, oh, it was ephedra and opium, or oh, it was
mm.
cannabis and ephedra, or it was like these different concoctions, kind of like what you're saying. But I think that there's no denying that there was psychoactive things happening for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely documented use regarding the kind of mainstream explanation for why there's so much kind of psychedelia in Islam in the architecture is there's a prohibition about depicting Allah and figures from the Quran. So it's a principle known as aniconism. You're not allowed to depict characters from the Quran. So that kind of just left architects with the kind of geometry, like, and there was an intention to represent Allah through the geometry. It was intended to represent his infinity and his beauty. So that's kind of the mainstream explanation for why mosques tend to look so psychedelic to us.
And it is something specific because if you look at like the Greek or the Roman mosaics, you know, they have a lot of those floors that they've done and the people, you know, archaeologists have uncovered, and they look nowhere near the same thing. There's definitely a distinct vibe about the art. It's the grand, you know, you could look at it two ways. So like you could go to like an old Catholic church, okay, and get that like grandiose feeling from like the bigness of it or like the architecture kind of a thing, and you're getting the same kind of a vibe, but just it's more visual, if that makes sense, from that. But you're in both settings. I feel like you are in the idea is to be in the presence of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, and I think that happens even if you don't believe in God personally. You know, you walk into these spaces and you're kind of, yeah, in an experience of awe based on the size and based on the geometry used. It has an effect whether you think it's dedicated to a deity or not, I think.
So you do a great job of kind of balancing having an open mind while also being skeptical and looking at the evidence that's out there. And that's why I really appreciate your work and appreciate your book. And it's something that I don't feel like is as common, which is unfortunate, but also that I don't think that a lot of people out there are very honest with themselves about these topics, right? Like we want to believe in life after death. We want there to be some higher power that's there overlooking us or protecting us, or we want there to be this romantic idea of the cosmos and why we're here and some sort of purpose or telos or whatever. But at the end of the day, it could all mean nothing. And I hate to sound like nihilistic or whatever, but it's just like, how do you balance all of that? Because in this realm of psychedelia consciousness, there is a lot of woo. There are a lot of people like pushing narratives and agendas and pretending like they have the answer or whatever. Like, how do you balance that out? How do you parse that out? You know, and how do you think that we move forward with all of this?
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult. Maybe just because of my personality or kind of my pre-existing beliefs. If something seems woo, then yeah, I tend to have maybe sometimes it's like a justified skepticism about it. Maybe sometimes it's a kind of cynicism. I might imagine it's a form of grift, and maybe sometimes it is a form of grift, a way of selling an idea because people are willing to pay for it. But if I'm not being too cynical, I think, yeah, like any good philosophy, you have to apply some critical thinking and some truth testing techniques. Um, I mean, what I like about Peter Sturstead Hughes in his book, Modes of Sentience, he kind of lays out ways to test the truths or get an idea of the truth of like claims in psychedelia. So you can use principles of rationality and coherence, whether there's common objects of experience that people have, whether they're detected through the senses or not. And yeah, different truth testing techniques, maybe in isolation and together, they're not going to establish truth, but they're ways of kind of pointing in the right direction. So for me, it's applying truth testing techniques, whether arguments are based on evidence and reason, if they commit logical fallacies or not, yeah, there's different aspects of arguments that I think can point to or away from truth.
Yeah, the fallacy thing's wild because if you pull out all the fallacies, you're left with pretty much no, dialogue or dialectic because most people have incorporated all those fallacies into their every sentence for, me included. When I'm trying to, there's basic ones like straw man, like there's ones that we can all kind of call out, right? Or argument from position of power, things like that. But yeah, I think that you make a good point. I've run into that with this podcast. We started off very woo. I was very kind of going through like a spiritual awakening when we started this podcast, and through reading all these books, doing all this research, talking with all these people, I've come to the conclusion that yeah, there is this true fringe out there. It's called metaphysics, and it's things that we haven't been able to quantify or understand through measurement or scientific method or whatever. Maybe we will in the future, maybe we won't, but this idea of all this magic out there, it's just kind of everybody's on their own path. I felt like for a portion of doing this podcast, I felt like I was kind of what I've learned I should try and curate for other people, but I realize everybody's kind of on their own trip or their own journey, and they'll come across things or entertain things when it's their time, so it's kind of frustrating, right? I mean, I know when you study cognitive biases or you understand these philosophical concepts and you're having a conversation with somebody and they don't understand heuristic, but you're in some sort of heuristic argument online with some, like things like that. Like it's just, we're in this culture where the internet's new, we're seeing all these different perspectives all at once, and I don't think what you and I are doing are necessarily wrong. I think, you're putting your information out there and things that you learned in your experiences and your philosophies, and I'm trying to do the same, and that's kind of like all we can do, right? Because there's nothing worse than somebody trying to push something upon you, whether it's right or wrong, right? So I don't know. That's just my little rant about that.
Yeah, no, it's tough, but I respect your kind of open attitude towards these topics, and I mean, no one can get rid of cognitive biases. I mean, they come up at one point or another, but you can always become more aware of them and what they are, and so it's probably just a never-ending journey of becoming more aware of where we lead ourselves into messes and kind of poorly formed arguments. I'm sure I do it all the time, as anyone else does, and I guess it's okay. It's more about learning to be okay with making mistakes along the way and being biased, but enjoying the journey of being less biased. I guess if that's something to enjoy.
Yeah, and look, there's some people that don't care. There's some people that just want to be entertained. They want to hear the craziest DMT jesters, trip report, which I do too. I want to hear that, like I'm just, I think that there's some people that just want to be entertained, and that's fine too. I think my problem is when some of those people then step foot into the realm of debate or righteousness or, being evangelical about something that maybe there's not a whole lot of evidence or proof for, and then they, attack or whatever. So it's like, it's fine to have fun conversations and speculate, shoot the shit, like us talking about whether plants have a soul or not, like those are, but I think that there's like a level of responsibility that some people just don't have, which is fine, but then don't claim to have that responsibility, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. I mean, there's maybe an assumption that I mean, there is some research that psychedelics make you more open-minded over time, and it kind of maintains that. But yeah, it's not really a hard and fast rule, and it's possible to be open towards some ideas and not others. So yeah, I mean, psychedelics don't always make you more open-minded to everything. And sometimes they make you more open to kind of worse ideas. I mean, openness is, as a personality trait, it's kind of neutral. I mean, people high in openness might be predisposed to conspiratorial thinking, or they might be predisposed to philosophical thinking. So it's not really, psychedelics don't determine which way you go. They don't determine which way you go. It's more based on other underlying factors like who your friends are, the culture you're in, the news you ingest, a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about, I think the psychedelic stuff, and it does give hope for there being something more, in the sense that it's literally the only way to alter your consciousness with being like fully able to integrate into the world or interact with the world, right? Because dreams, meditation, anything near-death experiences, all those involve like being incapacitated or on the verge of like non-normal consciousness, right? So I think that that's why this is such a big topic, and why some of these questions are important, is because this is the one tool that we do have to kind of examine these things, if you will, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you mean. They're definitely in a sense, the most reliable or effective tool towards altered states. Yeah, I mean, some people are going to prefer other methods, and a lot of other methods definitely have fewer risks. So, I mean, I definitely support a kind of pluralistic um, approach. I mean, as more information comes out about the kind of risks and harms of psychedelics, I think it is important that certain people have, yeah, better understanding of other techniques like breath work and meditation and yoga, and even just like other things where it's more group activity based, like going to festivals or playing music together. I think there's different ways to kind of reach these ecstatic states of mind, which, yeah, can lead to benefits, but some are going to appeal to different people, some are riskier for other people. So I think it's good to have options.
Yeah, for sure. And there are definitely ways to alter your consciousness. I think that the psychedelic one is just one where we can all, it's, you're going to take something and you're going to feel something, unless you have some sort of rare condition or something that, but, for the interesting thing, I know that there are a lot of people like scientists and, psychologists, psychiatrists taking these substances and compounds and kind of exploring too. My pet peeve is the thing where it's like, I'm a scientist, of course I haven't tried that. It would, they're worried about their own mind or breaking their mind or whatever. But I think that right there, that's part of the problem. Not that they have to take it, but that they're studying something that they feel like if they took it, but then I don't know. That's just, to me, that's kind of like a pet peeve. It's like you're passing judgment on something you're not even, you're interested in it, but you're not willing to do it yourself because you're worried it's going to do something. I don't know. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's kind of like a...
Yeah, I've definitely come across it. I mean, it does tie into the debate about whether psychedelic therapists like have to have personal experience. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated debate. I mean, I don't think every psychedelic researcher needs to have personal experience, because I mean, there's many things that, in a sense, are psychoactive, like antidepressants or antipsychotics or benzodiazepines that people study but don't
Yeah,
take or have experience.
my whole thing. It's more of the people that are saying that they're not willing to experiment on their own brains. Like, it's like, for instance, psilocybin, like one of the safest psychoactive in terms of like the LD scale, and
Mm.
yeah, there's always a risk when you do anything psychoactive if you have a history of schizophrenia or, you know, instability within your mind or something along. I mean, I have personally have severe OCD, which I've talked about many times on the show, and they've helped me. So it's like there's a weird dichotomy there where people are worried that it's going to make them go crazy, but also these things are being used to help people that, no offense, again, I'm one of these people that are crazy. So, you know, where's that line or that, like, what's going on there? That's kind of an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's a conflict. It might, yeah, there might be different reasons. It might be like persistent stigma against psychedelics, like it makes people more afraid than they should be, or legality issues, or just a lack of connections for guides or therapists they would actually trust to supervise their sessions. Yeah, I mean, psychedelics still, for the most part, in most of the world, exist in a illicit market with kind of, yeah, just residual stigma from the 60s. So there's still, yeah, fears, sometimes founded, but sometimes they're kind of just a vestige of kind of media sensationalism about losing your mind forever, the never-ending trip, flashbacks, you know, thinking you've turned into a glass of orange juice, you know, all kinds of stuff.
To your point too about the should psychiatrists or psychologists try these things. So I don't know about that, but what I do know is from going to many therapists and psychiatrists because of my OCD, the lack of knowledge of what's actually going on in the brain. And I'm not, maybe I didn't see the right people, maybe there's better experts out there, whatever, but just it was almost like patronizing.
Mm,
In a way, like the therapy, and I'm pretty open minded and try anything to better myself or feel better or whatever. But that's just one of those things where it's like I don't the whole mental health thing is so messed up in terms of like what we know, what they're prescribing, what's available, the treatments that are available. So on one hand, I understand this push for the psychedelic stuff because there is this like urgency to fix this ongoing problem that we're all facing, which is mental health. And maybe we're all just becoming more aware of ourselves and our issues. Maybe that's part of it too.
mm.
But at the same time, like I said, I mean, I've been in rooms where people are telling me how I'm feeling or things that I can fix myself. Like, you think that that's going to help? You think I haven't tried that? Come on. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely it's one of the more frustrating things to hear. The whole "Have you tried X" thing. You know, whether it's someone you know telling you that, or it's a therapist or psychiatrist, it always just grates the wrong way. Like it never comes across well.
Well,
Um,
and I think that it's there. Look, I guess what I'm saying is for some, it would be almost helpful to have somebody like for that I have OCD to have a therapist that has OCD because when I read,
mm,
I've been able to help other people that have it just by talking to them and explaining to them like my perspective on things
mm,
like that. As where somebody who doesn't have it doesn't understand that mindset or that way that you know like the I call it like a mind loop. Like there's this like mind loop thing that happens, and
mm,
instead of writing it off as some sort of chemical imbalance or some sort of thing that's off there, I think it's more of an ingrained thought pattern issue. And I think that when people just try and prescribe things or say it's this or that or you need to do this, and they really have no fucking clue what they're talking about, I think that's the problem that we're kind of in right now.
yeah, definitely. And it speaks to the kind of need for other forms of support, whether it's like peer support groups, or yeah, support groups tailored to specific conditions like OCD or addiction or depression. Often people, from my experience, speaking to people with like quite severe mental illness is there can be a knee-jerk reaction to kind of want to suggest something that's going to help them or to like get them to see a different perspective. But often I find they just want their thoughts and experiences to be seen, to be validated, to be understood, to be empathized with. Um, and yeah, this is kind of the whole approach of like Carl Rogers, which is that people change once they accept what's going on for them. So acceptance isn't a kind of passive thing. It's not an indifference, but through being understood and accepted, often people do start to feel more human and they start to feel more authentic and they just start to feel better. So yeah, it's definitely an aspect of kind of well-being that maybe isn't as recognized in many psychiatric or therapeutic approaches.
Absolutely. Well, let's start to wrap it up here. Is there anything about your book or your research that you want to add that we didn't touch on, or just anything you want to say or learned or anything like that?
Um, there's no kind of like specific debates that come to mind, but yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of topics in the book we didn't get to touch on. Yeah, there's philosophical topics like the sublime, and which is kind of the experience of awe, which I look at from a philosophical point of view. Because I think one of the kind of common themes of psychedelics is this experience of being simultaneously overwhelmed but fascinated with what's happening. And yeah, many philosophers have talked about this feeling, the sublime, Edmund Burke, Kant, Schopenhauer. Um, and yeah, modern research has started to tie this feeling to improvements to mental health. So yeah, it's definitely a under-discussed aspect of psychedelics, I think. So um, yeah, and there's some other topics in the book like deja vu, which is very common with DMT, and I talk about the visions of symbols and strange writing we mentioned earlier. So I kind of get into neuroscience perspectives on that and the different artists who have tried to recreate those symbols, such as Alison Gray, the wife of Alex Gray. Um, yeah, so yeah, I definitely recommend if people want to read more about these topics. Yeah, I have chapters dedicated to them.
Absolutely. And yeah, your writings on the sublime in there were great. I do recall that, and like fear and anxiety as well, as some of the stuff that we just mentioned. Existential joy.
Mm.
You have a lot of cool themes in there, and definitely stuff that is definitely worth checking out. So if anybody's interested, I have the links down below. I have the link to Sam's website, and the two links below that are ways that you can buy his book. Is it a just a hard copy, or do you have a virtual copy as well?
Yeah, it's in paperback and available as an ebook as well. So
Okay, cool.
yeah, we've got both
Are you gonna
versions.
do like a audio or an audible?
There's no plan to. I think my publisher might later release an audiobook, but it's not going to be narrated by me. So um, yeah, I have to wait and see about
Okay.
that.
You
Yeah.
should though. You should do it.
Yeah, it tends to be better when the author does it because they kind of know
Yeah. The
the rhythm
flow.
and
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
You just don't have the time, or just don't have the.
Yeah, there's been no plan to kind of do it, but it could be something worth talking about. If not for this book, then maybe the next one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little beefy. I think it might take you a little time, but it probably because
Yeah,
the recording you have to start, stop, kind of a thing.
yeah,
But
yeah,
um,
definitely.
you might be able to work it out there. But
Mm.
no, I really appreciated reading it, and I appreciated your insights. And it's always fun having you on to talk about this stuff. And are you still doing all the freelance, journalistic stuff too as well?
Yeah, still writing. I maybe starting a new role for a new psychedelic blog. It'll be more of an editorial role, but it's still in the works. So, but that'd be really cool. It would give me a chance to kind of recruit writers and kind of have a vision for psychedelic content going forward. Yeah, I definitely have a lot of ideas for the kinds of subjects I want to see covered. Yeah, I think there's a lot of topics related to harm reduction, safety, ethics, as well as philosophy. It'd be cool to see more like philosophy topics become more normal related to psychedelics. So
Yeah, I mean, from doing like the Masters of Rhetoric series and just talking about philosophy a lot on this podcast, it's a great way to be aware of your own biases, to understand the evolution of thought, to how we arrived at where we are from, a standpoint of what we understand about not just the world around us, but our, the people in our lives and how we interact and dialogue and everything. And when people are like, "Oh, philosophy's dead," well, it's like, yeah, is it? Because we still incorporate all those things. Even science came out of philosophy, and the pre-Socratics and the Ionian natural philosophers and things like that. So I think that philosophy is massively important. It's becoming a lost art to have an actual conversation or a dialogue. Use dialectic, which is trying to arrive at some sort of truth together, as opposed to what's going on right now out there, which is heuristic. It's people arguing for the sake of arguing to try and be right or get one up on each other or whatever the case may be. So with all that taken into account, like I said, I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate your approach, which is, open-minded yet cautious, and just looking at all the information that's out there. That's all we try and do on this show as well, is let's entertain these weird and interesting ideas, but let's not, be so open-minded that our brains fall out of the back of our heads. So,
definitely.
But yeah, man, thank you so much for coming on. And I highly recommend his book. If you're interested in supporting Mind Escape, you can click on the Mind Escape link below as well. And I just released episode 5 of Masters of Rhetoric, which is Plato and the Sophists, where I go through the interactions between Socrates and the Sophists, which are in the dialogues written by Plato. And yeah, I think that's about it. Again, if you're interested in older episodes, you can go to our Patreon for $2 a month. We have everything on there as well as exclusive content. But again, thank you so much for coming on, Sam. And I'll definitely have you back on in the future. And yeah, keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, really enjoyed the chat. Cheers.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. We love you, and have a good day.